Hello, Year 9 historians. Today we're going to be talking about the home front. So it's called the home front, kind of like how there's a front in a war where you have two opposing sides. This idea of the home front is kind of like what was going on back at home during the war, yeah? Because the war was very far away from Australia. So what was happening during World War One back at home in Australia? Let's find out. Right, learning goals. 1. You're going to know how World War One began to divide Australia. It was over conscription. You're going to know how women supported the war effort. And you're going to be able to solve problems. We're going to do a little activity where you solve problems. Okay, the war divides Australia. Taking these notes down, obviously. So, at the start of the war, most thought war was worth the sacrifice. Remember, as part of that whole militarism and nationalism thing, people thought war was heroic. And they were part of the British Empire. They thought the British Empire was under threat, so let's do it. Yeah, heaps of people volunteered to go to war at the start of World War One from Australia. But as it dragged on, many thought, this is not such a good idea after all. The government made a few changes during World War One. They increased taxes to pay for war. Increasing taxes is never popular. Surprise, surprise. And they passed laws restricting the freedom to say anything against war. This is what's known as censorship. In fact, let's define that word. Hey Google, define censorship.
This is the definition of censorship. The suppression or prohibition of any parts of books, films, news, etc. that are considered obscene, politically unacceptable, or a threat to security.
Prices rose massively during World War One, but wages were not allowed to rise because the government put a freeze on them. So that made everybody feel much poorer. And that made people unhappy. What can I say? It led to inequality, yeah. So the rich didn't feel that as badly as poor people did. And so the gap between the rich and the poor got bigger. That's inequality. There were large strikes over this inequality and these price rises during 1916 and 1917. Having a big strike in the middle of a war, tough. Most did still support the war. Now, the war began to divide Australia about whether or not we should still be in it. However, the majority still did support the war. And lots of people gave money to war-related charities, even school kids. Yay. So here's a group of recruits for the AIF, the Australian Infantry Force. Australian Imperial Force? Oh, I can't remember what that stands for. From Central Queensland. And they got that picture there because they want you to join them. That was like a recruiting poster. Right, so as the war went on, less and less people volunteered to join the war effort. Australia was the only country in World War One where its army was purely voluntary. So there were lots of volunteers at the start, but soon way less. As the war dragged on, people thought the war was going to be quick, and as the death toll mounted, less people wanted to join. Some said that men wouldn't volunteer. Some said that men that wouldn't volunteer should be ashamed. Yeah, so there were people back in Australia that if you didn't voluntarily join the war effort, people would shame you out. People would come along and give you a feather, meaning that you're a chicken. Can you imagine? Right, let's look at some recruitment posters. Australia has promised Britain 50,000 more men. Will you help us keep that promise? Yeah, so just think about the persuasive techniques they're using here. Yeah, they got the kangaroo, reference to our motherland, Britain, and all that. Here we go. So this one was a poster put up in South Australia. Coo-wee! Fall in. We want you at the front. Look at that. It's got the Great Britain flag there, not the Australian flag. Isn't that interesting? So it's appealing to people's love for Britain, I guess. So what's this one saying? Yeah. if you don't join the war now, then the Germans and so on might win, and then look, they'll come into your house, kill your family, and kill you. So the suggestion there being that you should go out and volunteer and fight. So, Great Britain, it's one of its national emblems is the lion. Yeah, so that's Great Britain. There's the lion. Help, answer the call. Helped by the young lions, Australia and New Zealand, stuff like that. The old lion, Great Britain, defies its foes. There you go. And that one's quite direct. Don't stand looking at this. Go and help. There you go. So these are all posters that were put up around Australia during World War One. Women played a really important role in World War One, in Australia's World War One effort. 3,000 women went to Europe with the army as nurses, and some of them died, just like soldiers. Now, because men went to war to fight, all of the work that those men did in their full-time jobs were taken up by women. So women entered the workforce in huge numbers, much bigger than they'd ever done before. Lots of women also volunteered, so worked for free, to make clothes and other supplies for soldiers. Unfortunately, when the men came back from war, most of those women were pushed out of those jobs and had to give them back to men. It was still a very sexist society back then. Yeah, bummer. So here we see a woman working in a factory. You wouldn't have seen this before World War One. This would have been extremely uncommon. This was considered men's work. I'm putting air quotes around that. Here are some Australian nurses going off to be nurses in Europe at the front. And here's a woman working in a munitions factory making bombs. I can't guarantee that that's an Australian one, but anyway, interesting picture. And here we go. Join us in a victory job. So there's a little recruitment poster for women to apply to volunteer or work in national service to help the war effort. Okay, a fun little problem-solving activity. Remember that some Australian men were made to feel ashamed for not volunteering to join the war, and sometimes people come up to them on the street and give them a little feather to say you're a chicken. This only needs to be 1 or 2 sentences, or you can draw a picture to represent it. I want you to think up one interesting way that, imagine that you're in World War One, how you can convince more Australian men to voluntarily join the war effort. Our first video today is the Australian home front during World War One. Check it out.
Australia had been an independent nation for less than 14 years when the First World War broke out. Although geographically remote, the Antipodean nations of Australia and New Zealand wasted no time in declaring their allegiance to Great Britain in its declaration of war against Germany. A standing army of 3,000 men expanded to 50,000 within months. And as Australian men and women ventured overseas on the long and arduous journey toward the various fronts of war, the population at home also braced for transformations that would leave indelible marks on the identity of a fledgling nation, which endures strongly to this day. The wartime contribution of Australians on the home front is a diverse and complex story, one which not only tested to the extreme the character of individual Australian men and women, but also led to major social, political and economic changes in the aftermath of events that shattered and reformed the world at the start of the 20th century. In this app, explore the impact of war on the Australian home front and experience a nation in transformation from 1914 onwards into the post-war years.
Our second video is called World War One: The Home Front. Take a look.
On the 4th of August 1914, Britain and the Commonwealth declared war on Germany. People celebrated the start of what became known as the Great War, and crowds gathered at Buckingham Palace to cheer. Patriotic enthusiasm and excitement followed the men as they flocked to recruiting offices to join the army and navy. Many people jeered the men who refused to fight. Huge crowds cheered and waved flags as the men marched away to war. As the war went on, fewer men volunteered to fight, so women were asked to encourage their menfolk. Women of Britain, say go. But what of those who stayed behind on the home front? The Great War affected everyone, including children. Some children helped to tend livestock and grow vegetables. Most of all, the war at home affected women. Women flocked to the factories as the men before them had rushed to the recruiting offices. Vital and dangerous work that men had done in the past was taken on by women. Making munitions, operating machinery, working with glass, gas and coal, running the railways, driving and repairing vehicles. Despite the hard and hazardous work, women enjoyed their new jobs and were proud to be doing their bit. The destruction and death of the Great War was not just overseas, but at home too, when bombs were dropped by zeppelins and aeroplanes. Germany's U-boat blockade caused food shortages in Britain. Food rationing was introduced to ensure that everybody was able to eat. The effects of the Great War were seen on the home front, with hospitals all over the country treating wounded men. Many towns and villages hosted refugees from Belgium. Other visitors were from much further away. Men from India, Africa, and the West Indies came to Britain to fight in the Great War. When the war finally ended in November 1918, the whole world had been shaken and remade. For women in particular, the changes would be long-lasting, and we still see the effects today.
Our reflection activity for today, it's a fairly straightforward one. I think you've done this before. Imagine that today's lesson, you're going to write a newspaper article about it. What would the headline be for today's lesson? And your homework. Right, that's the exciting bit. Answer these 3 questions in your exercise book. Remember to include the question and the answer. What did women do during the war? Why did people strike in 1916 and 1917? Should be a question mark on the end there. I'm going to draw one in. Check it out. There we go. And what did the Australian government do differently during World War I? Answer those 3 short questions. Now, some of you are keen as beans, and that's exciting, so here's some bonus homework for you. Read chapter 8.10 in the Jacaranda History Alive 9 textbook, and read this thing here, a little thing about Australian woman in World War I, bit.ly/AusWW1woman. Thank you so much for taking part in this lesson, and as I always say, keep it real.